Scientist number 1. Ettore Majorana, Vanishing Physicist, 1938. Ettore Majorana was one of the most brilliant theoretical physicists of the 20th century and a key member of Enrico Fermi's research group in Rome during the 1930s. Majorana made groundbreaking contributions to nuclear physics and quantum mechanics at an age when most scientists are still establishing their careers. His work on neutron theory and his predictions about particle physics were decades ahead of their time. But in March 1938, at the height of his intellectual powers, Majorana disappeared without a trace, leaving behind one of science's greatest unsolved mysteries. Born in Catania, Sicily in 1906, Majorana displayed extraordinary mathematical ability from childhood. He studied engineering at the University of Rome before switching to physics, where he joined Fermi's Institute in 1927. Majorana quickly distinguished himself with his profound insights into theoretical problems. Fermi considered Majorana the most talented member of his research group, saying he was comparable to Galileo and Newton in genius. Majorana published relatively few papers during his career, but each was remarkably original. His 1932 paper on neutrino theory introduced what became known as the Majorana equation, describing particles that are their own antiparticles. This concept was so advanced that experimental confirmation only came decades later. Majorana's work laid foundations for modern particle physics, though he received little recognition during his lifetime. In 1933, Majorana traveled to Germany and worked briefly with Werner Heisenberg in Leipzig. During this period, Majorana learned about the nuclear research being conducted across Europe, including early work that would eventually lead to nuclear weapons. Some historians believe Majorana became disturbed by the potential military applications of nuclear physics and the ethical implications of weapons capable of destroying cities. By 1937, Majorana had become increasingly withdrawn and depressed. He published almost nothing and avoided scientific gatherings. Friends noted his strange behavior and pessimistic outlook. Majorana spoke cryptically about the dangers of scientific knowledge and expressed doubts about whether humanity could handle the power that physics was unlocking. He seemed burdened by what he knew about nuclear energy and its potential for destruction. In March 1938, Majorana accepted a position as professor of theoretical physics at the University of Naples. On March 25, he sent a letter to his colleague Antonio Corelli, saying he regretted his decision and would not take the position. Majorana then boarded a ship from Naples to Palermo, carrying a substantial amount of cash and personal documents. He checked into a hotel in Palermo and sent 2 more letters to Corelli, contradicting his previous message and saying he would return to Naples. On March 26, Majorana purchased a ticket on the overnight ferry back to Naples. He was seen boarding the ship by several witnesses. But when the ferry arrived in Naples on the morning of March 27, Majorana was nowhere to be found. He never disembarked, and no trace of him was ever discovered. His cabin showed no signs of struggle, and his belongings were missing, suggesting he had taken them when he left the ship somehow during the night. Italian authorities launched an extensive search for Majorana. Police investigated the possibility of suicide, accident, or foul play. The Mussolini government took unusual interest in the case, personally ordering investigations and offering rewards for information. Family and colleagues desperately sought clues about what happened. But no body was found, no confirmed sightings emerged, and Majorana's fate remained completely unknown. Several theories attempt to explain Majorana's disappearance. The suicide theory suggests he jumped overboard during the ferry crossing, overwhelmed by depression and despair about the state of the world and science's role in potential destruction. However, no suicide note was found, and Majorana had withdrawn a significant amount of money before disappearing, which seems inconsistent with planning suicide. The voluntary disappearance theory proposes Majorana deliberately vanished to escape his life and scientific career. He may have hidden in a monastery or remote village under an assumed identity. Several alleged sightings of Majorana in various Italian locations surfaced over the years. In 2011, a prosecutor investigating the case concluded Majorana likely lived in Venezuela from 1955 to 1959 based on photographic evidence. But definitive proof of survival was never established. The most disturbing theory involves Majorana being silenced, because of knowledge about nuclear physics. By 1938, several countries were pursuing nuclear research with potential military applications. Majorana understood the theoretical basis for nuclear weapons and may have expressed opposition to such development. Some speculate he was killed or kidnapped by agents who wanted to control scientific knowledge or prevent him from sharing information with rivals. Another version suggests Majorana was recruited by a foreign power interested in his expertise. The Soviet Union, Germany, and other nations were actively seeking nuclear physicists. Majorana might have been approached with offers or threats, leading him to disappear voluntarily or under coercion. However, no evidence has emerged of Majorana working for any foreign government after his disappearance. The timing of Majorana's vanishing is significant. Within 5 years of his disappearance, the Manhattan Project began, and nuclear weapons became reality. The scientists who remained in the field grappled with profound ethical questions about their role in creating weapons of mass destruction. Majorana seemed to foresee these dilemmas and may have chosen to remove himself from a scientific enterprise he found morally intolerable. Majorana's mother, Dorina, never stopped searching for her son and refused to believe he was dead. She investigated reported sightings and followed every lead for decades. Other family members and colleagues continued seeking answers. The Italian government officially declared Majorana dead in 1975, but questions about his fate persist. The scientific community has honored Majorana's contributions, even as his disappearance remains mysterious. The Majorana particle predicted in his 1932 paper was experimentally confirmed in 2013, validating his decades-old theoretical work. His name is attached to important concepts in physics, ensuring his intellectual legacy endures. But the human story of what happened to Ettore Majorana remains unsolved. Did he commit suicide, disappear voluntarily, or meet a more sinister fate? Was his vanishing connected to his knowledge of nuclear physics and the dawning atomic age? The disappearance of one of the 20th century's most brilliant physicists at the threshold of the nuclear era continues to fascinate and trouble those who study the case. Majorana's story serves as a reminder that scientific knowledge can be a burden and that discovering too much may come with unexpected costs. Scientist number 2. Frank Olson, biological warfare researcher, 1953. Frank Olson was a respected biological warfare scientist working for the United States Army at Fort Detrick, Maryland, during the early 1950s. He specialized in aerobiology, studying how to disperse biological agents through the air. Olson worked on classified projects related to chemical and biological weapons development during the height of the Cold War. On November 28, 1953, Olson fell to his death from the 13th floor of the Statler Hotel in New York City. His death was initially ruled a suicide, but decades later, evidence emerged suggesting Olson may have been murdered because of what he knew about secret government programs. Frank Olson was born in 1910 and earned a doctorate in chemistry from the University of Wisconsin. During World War II, he joined the U.S. Army's biological warfare program working at Camp Detrick, which later became Fort Detrick. Olson was part of the Special Operations Division, a secretive unit that developed methods for covert biological attacks. He traveled internationally to observe biological warfare tests and advise on the weaponization of diseases. By 1953, Olson had been working in biological warfare for over a decade and had reached a senior position within the program. He held top-secret security clearances and was privy to some of the military's most sensitive projects. But Olson had become increasingly troubled by the nature of his work. He expressed ethical concerns about developing weapons designed to spread disease and questioned whether such research was morally acceptable. In November 1953, Olson attended a work retreat at Deep Creek Lake, Maryland. The retreat was organized by Olson's supervisor and attended by several scientists from Fort Detrick and CIA officers who worked with the biological warfare program. During the retreat, the participants were secretly given LSD in their drinks without their knowledge or consent. This was part of CIA's Project MKULTRA, which conducted experiments with mind-altering drugs on unwitting subjects. Olson had a severe reaction to the LSD, experiencing paranoia, anxiety, and psychological distress. His colleagues noted his disturbed behavior and agitation. After the retreat ended, Olson returned home to his wife and children, but his condition did not improve. He told his wife Alice that he had made a terrible mistake at work and wanted to quit his job. Olson seemed fearful and spoke of people trying to get him, though he did not explain who or why. Concerned about Olson's mental state, his supervisors arranged for him to see a psychiatrist in New York. On November 24, Olson traveled to New York accompanied by CIA officer Robert Lashbrook, who had been present at the Deep Creek Lake retreat. They checked into the Statler Hotel, and Olson met with Dr. Harold Abramson, a psychiatrist connected to CIA drug research programs. The doctor prescribed sedatives, but Olson's condition remained unstable. On the night of November 27, Lashbrook and Olson were sharing a hotel room on the 13th floor. At approximately 2:30 in the morning on November 28, Lashbrook awoke to the sound of crashing glass. He discovered that Olson had gone through the closed window blind and glass falling to his death on the sidewalk below. Lashbrook called his CIA supervisor before calling police or hotel security. Olson's death was immediately ruled a suicide. The official story presented to Olson's family was that Frank had been suffering from depression and had jumped from the window during a mental health crisis. The family was told nothing about the LSD experiment or the circumstances surrounding Olson's state of mind. Alice Olson and her 3 young children were left to grieve without understanding why Frank had killed himself. For over 20 years, the Olson family accepted the suicide explanation, though they were troubled by unanswered questions. Then, in 1975, a government commission investigating CIA abuses revealed the existence of Project MKUltra and mentioned that a biological warfare scientist had died after being given LSD. The Olson family realized this referred to Frank and demanded answers. Further investigation revealed disturbing details. Olson had been dosed with LSD without his consent as part of a CIA experiment. His psychological breakdown was a direct result of the drug and the violation of trust by his colleagues. The government acknowledged wrongdoing, and President Ford personally apologized to the Olson family. A financial settlement was paid, and the case seemed closed, though many questions remained. But in 1994, Frank Olson's body was exhumed for a second autopsy. Forensic pathologist James Starrs examined the remains and concluded that Olson's injuries were not consistent with a fall from a window. Specifically, Starrs found evidence of blunt force trauma to Olson's head that occurred before he went through the window. The forensic evidence suggested Olson may have been struck on the head, knocked unconscious, or killed, then thrown from the window to simulate suicide. This revelation transformed the case from a tragic consequence of an unethical experiment to a potential murder. Why would someone want Frank Olson dead? What did he know that made him dangerous? Eric Olson, Frank's son, spent decades investigating his father's death and uncovered disturbing possibilities about what Frank may have discovered. According to Eric's research, Frank Olson had traveled to Europe in summer 1953, months before his death. During this trip, Olson observed or learned about secret CIA interrogation sites where extreme techniques, including potential biological warfare agents, were being tested on human subjects. Olson was reportedly deeply disturbed by what he witnessed and expressed intentions to leave the biological warfare program and possibly expose what he had seen. If Olson was planning to resign and potentially reveal classified information about illegal human experiments and biological warfare programs, he would have been viewed as a severe security threat. The CIA and military officials involved in these programs might have decided Olson had to be silenced permanently. The LSD experiment at Deep Creek Lake may have been designed to assess Olson's loyalty and mental state, or to drive him to suicide. When Olson survived the LSD dosing and continued expressing intentions to quit, more drastic measures may have been taken. The scenario suggested by forensic evidence is that someone struck Olson on the head in the hotel room, then threw him through the window to stage a suicide. Robert Lashbrook, the CIA officer present in the room, has never fully explained what happened that night. Multiple investigations have examined Olson's death over the decades. A 1996 investigation by the Manhattan District Attorney concluded there was evidence of possible homicide, but the case was too old to prosecute. Documents related to Olson's death remain classified. The CIA has never admitted to murder, but also has not provided full transparency about what Olson knew or why he died. Frank Olson's case represents a disturbing example of a scientist who may have been eliminated because his knowledge and conscience made him a threat to powerful interests. Whether Olson was murdered or driven to suicide through unethical experimentation, his death was directly caused by secretive government programs that valued operational security over human life and ethics. The mystery endures because critical evidence remains classified and key witnesses are deceased. Frank Olson's family continues to seek the full truth about his death. His story serves as a warning about the dangers scientists face when they work on classified projects and discover information that makes them liabilities rather than assets. Scientist number 3. Dr. David Kelly, Weapons Inspector, 2003. Dr. David Kelly was a British biological warfare expert and United Nations weapons inspector who specialized in microbiology. Kelly was one of the world's leading authorities on biological weapons and had conducted numerous inspections in Iraq, searching for weapons of mass destruction. On July 17, 2003, Kelly was found dead in woods near his Oxfordshire home, shortly after being identified as the source for a controversial BBC News report about Iraqi weapons intelligence. His death was ruled a suicide, but forensic experts and family members have disputed this conclusion for 2 decades, raising questions about whether Kelly was silenced for what he knew. David Christopher Kelly was born in 1944 and earned degrees in botany and zoology before obtaining his doctorate in microbiology. He joined the British Ministry of Defence as a scientific advisor and became one of the government's leading experts on biological weapons. Kelly had extensive knowledge of Soviet and Iraqi biological weapons programs, having personally inspected facilities and interviewed scientists in both countries. His expertise made him invaluable to British and American intelligence agencies. In the lead-up to the Iraq War in 2003, the British government published a dossier claiming Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction that could be deployed within 45 minutes. This claim was used to justify military action against Iraq. But the intelligence supporting this assertion was disputed, and Kelly had concerns about how the information was being presented to the public. Kelly believed the government was exaggerating the threat to build support for war. In May 2003, BBC journalist Andrew Gilligan reported that the government had knowingly embellished intelligence in the dossier. Gilligan's source was anonymous, but described as a senior intelligence official. The British government furiously denied the allegations and launched an investigation to identify the source of the leak. Under pressure, Kelly admitted to his superiors that he had spoken with Gilligan, though he claimed he was not the primary source for the controversial claims. Kelly's name was publicly released by the Ministry of Defense in July 2003. He was immediately thrust into the media spotlight and subjected to intense scrutiny. Kelly was called to testify before the Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee, where he faced aggressive questioning about his conversations with journalists. Those who knew Kelly said he was deeply distressed by the public exposure and the suggestion he had betrayed his duty. Kelly was a private man, unused to media attention, and colleagues reported he seemed overwhelmed. On July 17, 2003, Kelly left his home, telling his wife Janice he was going for a walk. When he failed to return that evening, his family became concerned and reported him missing. The next morning, Kelly's body was discovered in woods near his home at Harrowdown Hill. Police found that Kelly had apparently cut his left wrist and consumed prescription painkillers. The death was quickly ruled a suicide. The official conclusion was that Kelly took his own life because of stress related to the media attention and parliamentary inquiry. However, numerous aspects of Kelly's death have troubled forensic experts and raised suspicions of foul play. Doctors who examined the case noted that the wounds to Kelly's wrist were relatively superficial and unlikely to have caused fatal blood loss. The amount of blood at the scene was inconsistent with death from severed arteries. The combination of a minor wrist wound and a relatively small dose of painkillers would typically not be sufficient to cause death. These medical anomalies led several physicians to conclude suicide was an unlikely cause. Kelly's family has consistently maintained that David would not have taken his own life. They describe him as a man who, despite the stress, was looking forward to retirement and had plans for the future. Kelly had been in email contact with colleagues on the day he died, making arrangements for upcoming work. His behavior did not suggest someone planning suicide. Family members believe the stress Kelly felt was being used as a convenient explanation to cover up something more sinister. The investigation into Kelly's death, called the Hutton Inquiry, focused primarily on the political controversy surrounding the intelligence dossier, rather than thoroughly examining the circumstances of the death itself. Lord Hutton concluded Kelly committed suicide due to stress, but many felt the inquiry was more concerned with protecting the government than finding the truth about what happened to Kelly. Medical records and autopsy reports related to Kelly's death were ordered sealed for 70 years, an extraordinary measure that fueled speculation about a cover-up. In 2010, a group of doctors formally challenged the suicide verdict, demanding a full inquest. They presented evidence that Kelly's wounds were insufficient to cause death and suggested he may have been murdered. The doctors theorized Kelly could have been killed by persons unknown, possibly intelligence agents, who wanted to silence him before he could reveal more about the manipulation of Iraqi weapons intelligence. The British government refused to reopen the case, maintaining the original suicide conclusion was correct. Several theories about Kelly's death have been proposed. Some believe Kelly was assassinated by British or American intelligence services because he knew too much about the fabrication of evidence for the Iraq War. Kelly's expertise meant he understood exactly how intelligence was being distorted, and he may have been preparing to expose this publicly. Silencing Kelly would prevent embarrassing revelations about government deception. The staged suicide would deflect attention from murder. Another theory suggests Iraqi agents may have killed Kelly. If Iraq learned that Kelly was a key source of intelligence about their weapons programs, they might have targeted him for revenge or to prevent further disclosures. However, this theory is considered less likely because Iraqi intelligence capabilities in Britain would have been limited, and Kelly's death came after the invasion, when Iraqi government structures had collapsed. The most mundane explanation is that Kelly genuinely took his own life because the pressure of public exposure and the parliamentary inquiry became unbearable. The medical evidence suggesting insufficient blood loss might be explained by factors like body position or blood clotting that affected how much was visible at the scene. The sealing of records for 70 years might reflect sensitivity about the family's privacy rather than conspiracy. This explanation requires accepting that multiple forensic experts who questioned the suicide verdict were mistaken. What makes Kelly's case particularly significant in the context of missing or silenced scientists is what he knew about biological weapons and intelligence manipulation. Kelly had access to highly classified information about weapons programs in multiple countries. He understood how intelligence agencies operated and how governments used scientific expertise to justify policy decisions. If Kelly had decided to publicly reveal that intelligence was being deliberately exaggerated or fabricated to justify war, he would have been an extremely credible and damaging witness. The timing of Kelly's death, just as controversy over Iraqi weapons intelligence was intensifying, seems suspicious to those who question the official story. Kelly died before he could provide more information to journalists or potentially testify further about what he knew. Whether his death was suicide or something more sinister, the result was the same. A key expert with uncomfortable knowledge was silenced at a crucial moment. The Kelly case demonstrates the pressures faced by scientists who work on classified government projects. When their knowledge conflicts with official narratives, or when they consider revealing information authorities want kept secret, they may face severe consequences. Whether through stress-induced suicide as officially concluded, or through more sinister means as some suspect scientists with dangerous knowledge can end up dead, leaving unanswered questions about what they knew and why they died. Scientist number 4. The Marconi scientists. Defense contractors, 1982 to 1990. Between 1982 and 1990, a disturbing pattern emerged in the United Kingdom. More than 24 scientists and engineers who worked on classified defense projects died under suspicious circumstances within a relatively short time period. Many of these researchers worked for Marconi electronic systems and related defense contractors on projects connected to the Strategic Defense Initiative known as Star Wars. The deaths included unusual suicides, bizarre accidents, and unexplained circumstances that raised questions about whether these researchers were targeted because of their work on sensitive military technology. The cluster of deaths first came to public attention in the mid-1980s, when journalists noticed that an unusual number of defense industry scientists were dying. The victims were primarily British nationals working for companies like Marconi GEC Plessy and other contractors involved in advanced weapons research. The projects they worked on included radar systems, electronic warfare equipment, missile guidance, and directed energy weapons. Many were involved in highly classified work related to the American Strategic Defense Initiative program. The circumstances of the deaths were often bizarre. Several scientists allegedly committed suicide using methods that seemed elaborate or unusual. One researcher died after his car was found filled with exhaust fumes with a hose running from the tailpipe. Another was found dead with a plastic bag over his head secured with a rope. These methods, while technically consistent with suicide, struck investigators and family members as unnecessarily complicated for someone simply wanting to end their life. Other deaths involved strange accidents. Scientists fell from bridges, plunged from buildings, or died in single-car crashes under circumstances that raised questions. In several cases, autopsies found no clear cause of death, or the medical findings were ambiguous. Families insisted their loved ones had no history of depression or suicidal ideation, and expressed shock that suicide was being concluded. The sheer number of deaths among a relatively small professional community seemed statistically improbable. Arshad Sharif, a computer scientist who worked on satellite and weapons guidance systems, was found dead in 1986. He had allegedly driven to a remote location, tied a rope around his neck, attached the other end to a tree, then driven his car forward to break his neck. The elaborate nature of this method led to questions about whether someone else had staged the scene. Sharif's work on military satellite systems meant he had access to highly classified information. Vimal Dajibhai, a software engineer also working on missile guidance systems, fell to his death from the Bristol Suspension Bridge in 1986. His death was ruled suicide, though he left no note, and family said he had been in good spirits. David Sands, a satellite projects manager, died when his car inexplicably crashed into a building at high speed. The crash occurred in broad daylight, on a straight road, and investigators found no mechanical failure. Sands had been working on satellite communications for military applications. Trevor Knight, a computer engineer, was found dead at his home in 1988. Knight had worked on missile guidance computers for Marconi. His death was ruled suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning, but the circumstances were unusual, and his family disputed the conclusion. Avtar Singh Gita, a computer scientist working on underwater guidance systems for torpedoes, disappeared and was found drowned weeks later. The death was considered accidental, but raised questions about what had happened. By 1987, British media were openly discussing whether the pattern of deaths might indicate foul play. Conspiracy theories emerged suggesting several possible culprits. Some theorized Soviet intelligence was assassinating British scientists to slow Western weapons development during the Cold War. The KGB had a history of targeting defectors and intelligence assets and might have expanded operations to include eliminating key defense researchers. Another theory proposed that the deaths were connected to the scientists discovering something in their work that powerful interests wanted, kept secret. Perhaps the weapons systems being developed had dangerous flaws, or the research revealed information that would be embarrassing or threatening to governments or corporations. Scientists who learned these secrets and might reveal them could have been systematically eliminated to ensure silence. A more elaborate conspiracy theory suggested the scientists were being killed because they had learned about UFO-related technology. Some of the defense projects involved radar systems and electronic warfare equipment that allegedly had detected unidentified aerial phenomena. If researchers discovered evidence of extraterrestrial technology or government knowledge of UFOs, they might have been silenced to protect these secrets. While this theory is the most speculative, it gained traction in UFO research communities. Skeptics argued the cluster of deaths was coincidental. The defense industry employed thousands of scientists and engineers. Over an 8-year period, some number of deaths from suicide accident and natural causes would be expected. The clustering might reflect selective attention, where researchers noticed deaths among defense workers because they were looking for a pattern while ignoring similar death rates in other professions. Statistical analysis of whether the death rate exceeded normal expectations produced ambiguous results. Investigations by British authorities concluded there was no evidence of a conspiracy or coordinated targeting of defense scientists. Each death was examined individually and found to have natural or self-inflicted causes. No evidence of foul play or connection between the deaths was discovered. officials maintained that the pattern was coincidental and that public speculation was creating conspiracy theories without factual basis. However, the families of several victims remained convinced their loved ones had been murdered. They pointed to the classified nature of the work, the unusual circumstances of some deaths, and the statistical clustering as evidence something more than coincidence was occurring. Private investigators hired by families found inconsistencies in official explanations, but lacked authority to force reopening of cases. The Marconi scientists' deaths remain one of the most controversial clusters of mysterious deaths in modern history. Whether the deaths represent a genuine pattern of assassinations, a series of tragic coincidences, or something in between continues to be debated. What is undeniable is that more than 24 highly skilled researchers working on sensitive military technology died under circumstances that raised suspicions, and that their families and some investigators believed something sinister was happening. The case illustrates the vulnerability of scientists working on classified projects. Their knowledge makes them valuable, but also potentially dangerous if they learn secrets that powerful interests want protected. Whether through espionage, corporate or government malfeasance, or tragic coincidence, the Marconi scientists died without clear answers about why so many perished in such a short time. Their deaths serve as a reminder that working on the cutting edge of weapons technology may come with risks beyond the laboratory. Scientist number 5. Karen Silkwood, nuclear whistleblower, 1974. Karen Silkwood was a chemical technician and labor union activist who worked at the Kerr-McGee plutonium processing plant in Oklahoma. In 1974, Silkwood was investigating safety violations and alleged misconduct at the facility, including improper handling of radioactive materials. On November 13, 1974, Silkwood died in a single-car crash while driving to meet a journalist with documentation about safety problems at the plant. Her death has been the subject of controversy and investigation for 5 decades, with enduring questions about whether she was silenced for what she discovered. Karen Gay Silkwood was born in 1946 in Texas and moved to Oklahoma as an adult. In 1972, she began working at the Kerr-McGee Cimarron fuel fabrication site, a facility that produced plutonium pellets for nuclear reactor fuel rods. Silkwood worked as a laboratory analyst testing plutonium samples. The work was dangerous, involving direct handling of one of the most toxic substances known to science. Workers were supposed to follow strict safety protocols to prevent contamination and exposure. By 1974, Silkwood had become active in the Oil Chemical and Atomic Workers Union, representing employees at the plant. She grew concerned about safety practices at the facility, believing Kerr-McGee was cutting corners and exposing workers to unnecessary radiation risks. Silkwood documented instances where quality control records appeared to be falsified, where plutonium was improperly stored, and where contamination controls were inadequate. She believed management was prioritizing production speed and profit over worker safety. Silkwood gathered evidence of the safety violations and shared her concerns with union leadership and the Atomic Energy Commission. In November 1974, she traveled to Washington to meet with union officials and provide testimony about conditions at the Kerr-McGee plant. During this period, Silkwood was conducting her own investigation, collecting documents and photographs that she believed would prove management was knowingly violating safety regulations. On November 5, 1974, Silkwood discovered she had been contaminated with plutonium. Testing showed plutonium on her hands, and shortly after, contamination was found in her apartment. The levels of contamination were significant and raised questions about how the exposure had occurred. Silkwood and her supporters believed she had been deliberately contaminated, possibly to discredit her or frighten her into silence. Kerr-McGee claimed the contamination was accidental and resulted from Silkwood's own carelessness. The source of Silkwood's contamination was never definitively determined. Some plutonium was found in food in her refrigerator, suggesting it had been placed there intentionally. If Silkwood had accidentally contaminated herself at work, the plutonium would have been on her person, not inside sealed food containers in her home. This evidence supported the theory that someone had accessed Silkwood's apartment and deliberately contaminated her environment, but no proof of who might have done this was ever found. On November 13, 1974, Silkwood attended a union meeting in Crescent, Oklahoma. After the meeting, she left to drive to Oklahoma City, where she was scheduled to meet with David Burnham, a reporter for the New York Times, and Steve Wodka, an official from the union. Silkwood had told colleagues she was bringing documents that would prove the safety violations at Kerr-McGee. These documents supposedly included evidence of falsified quality control records and photographs showing dangerous conditions. Silkwood never made it to the meeting. Around 7:30 that evening, her Honda Civic ran off Highway 74 south of Crescent and struck a concrete culvert. Silkwood died in the crash. Oklahoma Highway Patrol investigated and concluded Silkwood had fallen asleep at the wheel, and the accident was not suspicious. However, circumstances of the crash immediately raised questions. The car showed damage consistent with having been struck from behind before leaving the road. Investigators for the union found dents and scratches, suggesting another vehicle had forced Silkwood off the highway. No documents or files were found in the crashed car, despite multiple witnesses saying Silkwood had a folder or manila envelope with her when she left the union meeting. Whatever evidence Silkwood was carrying to give to the reporter had vanished. An autopsy found Silkwood had a small amount of the sedative methaqualone in her system. Kerr-McGee's lawyers suggested Silkwood had been intoxicated or impaired, contributing to the accident. However, the level detected was low and unlikely to cause significant impairment. Silkwood's supporters argued that even if she had taken medication, it did not explain the damage to her car or the missing documents. The official investigation concluded the crash was a single-vehicle accident caused by driver error. No evidence of another vehicle or foul play was found. The Oklahoma Highway Patrol closed the case. But Silkwood's family and supporters rejected this conclusion, believing she had been run off the road and killed to prevent her from revealing damaging information about Kerr-McGee. Silkwood's family sued Kerr-McGee for negligence in her contamination. The civil trial became a platform for investigating the company's safety practices and the circumstances of Silkwood's death. In 1979, a jury found Kerr-McGee liable for the plutonium contamination and awarded Silkwood's estate $10 million. The verdict was later reduced, and eventually Kerr-McGee settled out of court. While the lawsuit addressed the contamination issue, it did not definitively resolve questions about the car crash. Multiple investigations and books have examined Silkwood's death. Some conclude she was murdered by persons unknown, possibly working for Kerr-McGee, or connected to the nuclear industry to silence her whistleblowing. The missing documents, the damage to her car, and the suspicious contamination all point toward foul play. Other investigations find the evidence insufficient to prove murder and accept the official accident conclusion despite the unanswered questions. The Silkwood case became a symbol of corporate callousness and the risks faced by whistleblowers. Karen Silkwood was a working-class woman trying to protect her fellow workers from radiation exposure. She discovered her employer was cutting corners and possibly breaking laws. When she tried to expose this, she died under circumstances that prevented her evidence from reaching the public. Whether she was murdered or simply unlucky, the effect was the same. A whistleblower was silenced. The case inspired the 1983 film Silkwood, starring Meryl Streep, which brought the story to mainstream attention. The movie portrayed Karen as a hero standing up to a powerful corporation. The film dramatized the events, but stayed largely true to the known facts of the case. It contributed to Karen Silkwood becoming an icon of worker safety advocacy and whistleblower protection. The Kerr-McGee facility where Silkwood worked was eventually shut down. Investigations found serious safety problems, and the company faced numerous violations. While Silkwood did not live to see justice, her efforts contributed to improved oversight of the nuclear industry and greater attention to worker safety. Her death, however, remains officially unexplained, with the mystery of what happened on Highway 74 that November night never fully resolved. Karen Silkwood joins the list of scientists and technicians who discovered uncomfortable truths and paid the ultimate price, whether through murder or tragic accident. Scientist number 6. Rodney Marks, Antarctic death, 2000. Dr. Rodney Marks was an Australian astrophysicist working at the Amundsen-Scott South Pole Station in Antarctica when he died under mysterious circumstances in May 2000. Marks collapsed after returning from outdoor work and died 36 hours later, despite efforts to treat him. An autopsy 6 months later revealed he died of methanol poisoning, but the source of the methanol was never identified. The case remains the only unsolved suspicious death in the history of the United States Antarctic program, and raises questions about what happened at one of the most isolated research stations on Earth. Rodney David Marks was born in 1968 in Geelong, Australia. He earned his doctorate in astrophysics from the University of Melbourne, studying the infrared properties of galaxies. Marks specialized in submillimeter astronomy, observing the universe at wavelengths between infrared and microwave radiation. Antarctica's cold, dry atmosphere makes it an excellent location for this type of research, and Marks was excited to work at the South Pole Station operating instruments for the Antarctic Submillimeter Telescope and Remote Observatory. The Amundsen-Scott South Pole Station is located at the geographic South Pole, the southernmost point on Earth. During the Antarctic winter, from roughly March through October, the station is completely isolated. No aircraft can fly in or out due to extreme cold and darkness. The winter crew typically consists of about 50 people who must be entirely self-sufficient. Medical emergencies are treated with whatever resources are available at the station because evacuation is impossible. In May 2000, Marks was part of the winter crew at the South Pole Station. On May 12th, he spent several hours outside working on equipment for the astrophysics experiments. When he returned inside the station, Marks became ill, complaining of nausea and feeling unwell. His condition deteriorated over the following day and a half. The station doctor treated him for what was initially believed to be altitude sickness, or perhaps a reaction to the extreme cold, but Marks continued to decline. Despite medical efforts, Marks died on May 12, 2000, at age 32. Because the station was in winter isolation, Marks's body could not be removed from Antarctica. It was preserved in the station's freezer for 6 months until October, when aircraft could finally land. The body was then flown to Christchurch, New Zealand, where an autopsy was performed. The autopsy revealed that Marks had died from methanol poisoning. Methanol, also known as wood alcohol, is highly toxic. Small amounts can cause blindness and death. The methanol concentration in Marks' body was at lethal levels. This finding was shocking because methanol is not a substance that would normally be present at an Antarctic research station. The discovery immediately transformed what had seemed like a natural death or accident into a potential poisoning case. Investigators from New Zealand Police and the United States National Science Foundation, which operates the Antarctic program, tried to determine how Marks had been exposed to methanol. They examined all substances at the South Pole Station looking for possible sources. Methanol is used in some laboratory equipment and might be present in very small quantities for scientific purposes. But no source was found that could account for the amount Marks had ingested or absorbed. One theory was that Marks had accidentally consumed methanol, thinking it was ethanol or another substance. Perhaps he had drunk from a mislabeled container, or consumed homemade alcohol contaminated with methanol. Making alcohol at the South Pole Station was against regulations, but some crew members occasionally brewed their own. If such illicit alcohol contained methanol from improper distillation, it could have been lethal. However, no evidence was found of Marks consuming homemade alcohol, and other crew members who might have shared such alcohol did not become ill. Another theory involved deliberate poisoning. Perhaps someone at the station had reason to harm Marks and put methanol in his food or drink. This theory raised the disturbing possibility of murder in one of the most isolated places on Earth. But investigators found no evidence of motive. Marks got along well with colleagues, and there were no known conflicts that might lead to violence. Interviewing the winter crew revealed no suspects or evidence of foul play. The investigation was hampered by several factors. The 6-month delay between Marks' death and the autopsy meant that evidence degraded and memories faded. The isolated nature of the South Pole Station meant outside investigators could not access the scene immediately. The small, tightly knit community at the station created an environment where people might be reluctant to implicate colleagues, and the international nature of the Antarctic program, involving multiple nations and agencies, complicated jurisdictional issues. New Zealand police conducted the investigation because Marks died in New Zealand when his body was in Christchurch, and because Marks was living in New Zealand when he traveled to Antarctica. But the death occurred at an American research station on Antarctic territory, where legal jurisdiction is ambiguous. Neither New Zealand nor the United States could definitively claim authority to prosecute a crime if one had occurred. This legal gray area may have affected the thoroughness and priority of the investigation. After extensive investigation, New Zealand police officially closed the case without determining how Marks was exposed to methanol. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as methanol poisoning, but the manner of death, whether accident, suicide, or homicide, was left undetermined. This official ambiguity has frustrated Marks's family, who believe their son was murdered, and that the investigation was inadequate. Marks's family has pushed for the case to be reopened. They argue that the amount of methanol in Marks's system indicates deliberate poisoning rather than accidental exposure. They believe the isolation of the South Pole Station allowed someone to commit murder, knowing that investigation would be delayed, and evidence might be destroyed or contaminated. The family has criticized both New Zealand and American authorities for not pursuing the case more aggressively. Several theories about Marks's death continue to circulate. Some suggest he stumbled onto sensitive information, possibly related to military activities or classified research occurring at the South Pole Station. Antarctica has been used for various secretive projects, and perhaps Marks learned something he was not supposed to know. This theory requires accepting that murder was committed to protect secrets, but it is speculative and unsupported by evidence. Another theory involves an accident where Marks was exposed to methanol through laboratory work. Perhaps he handled chemicals without adequate protection or was exposed to contaminated equipment, but experts note that the amount of methanol required to cause death would be difficult to absorb accidentally through skin contact or inhalation. Ingestion is the most likely route, which suggests either he drank it knowingly or unknowingly. The simplest explanation, though troubling, is that someone deliberately poisoned Marks for reasons unknown, and that the isolation of the South Pole Station made it impossible to conduct a proper investigation. The murderer, if there was one, is likely among the approximately 50 people who were at the station during winter 2000. But without evidence or confession, the case remains unsolved. Rodney Marks' death is the only unsolved suspicious death in the history of the United States Antarctic program. It stands as a reminder that even in the most remote and supposedly safe research environments, scientists can die under mysterious circumstances. Whether Marks was murdered or was the victim of a bizarre accident, his death illustrates the unique challenges of investigating incidents that occur in isolated extreme locations where normal forensic and investigative procedures cannot be easily applied. The case remains officially open, but inactive, with the mystery of what happened to Dr. Rodney Marks at the South Pole likely never to be fully solved. Scientist number 7. Vladimir Alexandrov, climate scientist, 1985. Dr. Vladimir Alexandrov was a prominent Soviet climate scientist who developed some of the first computer models demonstrating the nuclear winter effect. In March 1985, Alexandrov disappeared during a scientific conference in Madrid, Spain. He was last seen leaving his hotel and was never found despite extensive searches. His disappearance occurred at the height of the Cold War and raised questions about whether he was silenced by Soviet intelligence or defected to the West. The case remains one of the most mysterious vanishings of a prominent scientist and highlighted the political sensitivity of nuclear winter research. Vladimir Valentinovich Alexandrov was born in the Soviet Union and became a leading expert in climate modeling and atmospheric physics. By the early 1980s, he was working at the computing center of the Soviet Academy of Sciences in Moscow, where he developed sophisticated computer models to simulate Earth's climate. Alexandrov collaborated with Western scientists, including American researcher Carl Sagan, exploring how nuclear war would affect global climate systems. The nuclear winter theory emerged in the early 1980s, as scientists realized that a large-scale nuclear war would inject massive amounts of smoke and particles into the atmosphere. These particles would block sunlight, causing dramatic cooling that could last for months or years. Crops would fail globally, leading to mass starvation, even in regions not directly affected by nuclear weapons. The nuclear winter scenario suggested that a nuclear war would be even more catastrophic than previously understood, potentially ending human civilization regardless of who won the conflict. Alexandrov's computer models were among the most sophisticated analyses of nuclear winter. His work suggested that even a limited nuclear exchange could trigger significant climate effects. These findings had profound political implications. If nuclear war would cause global catastrophe, then the strategy of mutually assured destruction might be suicidal rather than rational. The Soviet government was interested in nuclear winter research because it supported arguments for arms control and reduction of nuclear arsenals. However, nuclear winter research was also politically sensitive. Some Soviet officials worried the research could be used by the West to argue for defensive systems or preemptive strikes. If nuclear winter made offensive war unwinnable, perhaps defensive capabilities or first strike scenarios would become more attractive. Alexandrov's prominence in this field made him a valuable scientist, but also someone whose work had implications for Soviet military and political strategy. In March 1985, Alexandrov traveled to Madrid, Spain, to attend an international conference on climate modeling. The conference brought together scientists from multiple countries, including both Western and Eastern Bloc researchers. Such conferences were opportunities for scientific exchange, but also for intelligence gathering and potential defections during the Cold War. Soviet scientists attending Western conferences were typically monitored by KGB handlers who ensured they did not defect or share sensitive information. On March 31, 1985, Alexandrov left his hotel in Madrid, apparently intending to go somewhere, though his destination was unclear. He took his passport with him, which was unusual for a simple outing. Alexandrov never returned to the hotel and never checked out officially. When he failed to appear at scheduled conference sessions, colleagues became concerned. Spanish police were contacted and a search began. Despite extensive investigation, no trace of Alexandrov was found. He had not used his passport to leave Spain or enter another country. His hotel room showed no signs of struggle or forced entry. Alexandrov had not withdrawn unusual amounts of money or made unusual purchases. He simply vanished. Spanish authorities found no evidence of crime, and no body was ever discovered. The case quickly became an international mystery. Several theories about Alexandrov's disappearance emerged. The defection theory proposed that Alexandrov had decided to remain in the West. Perhaps he was disillusioned with the Soviet system and saw the Madrid conference as an opportunity to escape. Western intelligence agencies might have helped him disappear, providing him with new identity and relocation. Under this theory, Alexandrov is living somewhere under an assumed name, having successfully defected. The assassination theory suggested Soviet intelligence killed Alexandrov because his research was politically inconvenient or because he was planning to defect. The KGB had a history of eliminating defectors and dissidents, including scientists. If Alexandrov had expressed intentions to remain in the West, or if Soviet authorities feared he would share classified information, assassination would be a plausible response. His body could have been disposed of in ways that prevented discovery. Another theory involved Western intelligence agencies eliminating Alexandrov to prevent him from continuing nuclear winter research that supported Soviet arms control positions. If Alexandrov's work was seen as propaganda beneficial to Soviet interests, Western agencies might have targeted him. However, this theory is considered less likely because Western scientists were also researching nuclear winter, and assassination would have been counterproductive. The accident theory suggests Alexandrov died accidentally in Madrid, perhaps through robbery, mugging, or traffic accident, and his body was never identified or linked to the missing scientist case. This explanation is mundane, but cannot be ruled out. However, the lack of any evidence of accident or foul play makes it seem incomplete. Soviet authorities claimed they had no knowledge of what happened to Alexandrov. They publicly stated he had disappeared, and they were seeking information. However, given the secrecy of Soviet intelligence operations, it is impossible to know whether official statements reflected genuine ignorance or were disinformation. If the KGB had killed Alexandrov, Soviet leaders might genuinely not know or might be deliberately concealing the truth. Alexandrov's wife and family in the Soviet Union maintained that he would not have defected voluntarily. They described him as loyal to the Soviet Union and unlikely to abandon his family. They believed he had been killed either by Soviet intelligence, fearing his defection, or by Western agencies for unknown reasons. The family's suffering was compounded by uncertainty, never knowing if Alexandrov was dead or living somewhere in hiding. The scientific community mourned the loss of a brilliant researcher. Carl Sagan, who had collaborated with Alexandrov, paid tribute to his work and expressed hope he might someday be found alive. The disappearance highlighted the tensions of Cold War science, where researchers working on politically sensitive topics could become targets or casualties of intelligence operations. Decades later, the Alexandrov case remains unsolved. No definitive evidence has emerged explaining what happened to him. The collapse of the Soviet Union led to some release of KGB archives, but no documents relating to Alexandrov have been disclosed. If Soviet intelligence was involved, those records remain classified or destroyed. If Alexandrov defected, he has never surfaced or revealed himself. The case serves as a reminder of the dangers faced by scientists whose work has political and military implications. Nuclear winter research threatened established strategic doctrines and challenged assumptions about nuclear war. Alexandrov's sophisticated models made arguments that powerful interests may have found threatening. Whether he was killed for his science, defected to escape political pressure, or met some unknown fate, his disappearance remains one of the Cold War's enduring mysteries. Vladimir Alexandrov vanished from Madrid in 1985, and wherever he is or whatever happened to him, the world lost a scientist trying to understand how humanity might survive its most dangerous weapons. Scientist number 8. Don Wiley, Immunology Researcher, 2001. Dr. Don Wiley was a world-renowned immunology researcher and professor at Harvard University, specializing in how viruses interact with the immune system. On November 15, 2001, Wiley disappeared after leaving a scientific conference in Memphis, Tennessee. His rental car was found abandoned on a bridge over the Mississippi River, with keys in the ignition and gas tank full. Wiley's body was discovered a month later in the river. The death was ruled accidental, but the circumstances and timing shortly after the September 11 attacks and during the anthrax letter incidents raised questions about whether the bioterrorism expert was targeted. Donald C. Wiley was born in 1944 in Akron, Ohio. He earned his doctorate in biophysics from Harvard in 1970 and spent his entire career studying structural biology and immunology. Wiley became one of the world's leading authorities on how viruses, particularly influenza, enter human cells and how the immune system recognizes and fights infections. His work was foundational to understanding viral diseases and developing vaccines and treatments. By 2001, Wiley had received numerous honors for his research, including election to the National Academy of Sciences. He was a Howard Hughes Medical Institute investigator, a prestigious position that provided funding and resources for his laboratory at Harvard. Wiley's research had implications for biodefense, as his expertise in how pathogens interact with humans was directly relevant to understanding and countering biological weapons. In November 2001, Wiley traveled to Memphis, Tennessee, for the annual meeting of the Scientific Advisory Board of St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. St. Jude is a leading pediatric research facility, and Wiley was consulting on infectious disease research. The meeting took place November 15th and included a banquet dinner that evening. Colleagues remember Wiley being in good spirits, participating fully in discussions, and showing no signs of distress. Around midnight, Wiley left the banquet to return to his hotel in downtown Memphis. He was driving a rented car, and the route from St. Jude to his hotel normally took about 15 minutes. Wiley never arrived. When he failed to check out of his hotel the next morning and missed his flight back to Boston, colleagues became concerned and reported him missing. On November 16th, Wiley's rental car was found abandoned on the Hernando de Soto Bridge, a large highway bridge spanning the Mississippi River between Tennessee and Arkansas. The car was parked on the narrow shoulder, facing the wrong direction, as if Wiley had pulled over while heading out of Memphis. The keys were in the ignition, the tank was full of gas, and Wiley's wallet and identification were in the car. There was no note and no signs of struggle. The bridge has no pedestrian walkway, and the guardrail was intact, showing no evidence that anyone had climbed over it. A massive search operation began immediately involving multiple law enforcement agencies and the FBI. Divers searched the Mississippi River beneath the bridge. Helicopters and boats scoured the waterway. Search teams examined the riverbanks for miles in both directions. Days passed with no sign of Wiley. The mystery of what happened on the bridge deepened with each passing day. On December 20, Wiley's body was found in the Mississippi River near Vidalia, Louisiana, about 300 miles downstream from Memphis. The body was badly decomposed, making precise cause of death difficult to determine. The medical examiner concluded that Wiley had drowned, and that the death was consistent with accidental fall from the bridge. There were no obvious signs of trauma or foul play. The ruling was that Wiley had accidentally fallen from the bridge and drowned. The official explanation suggested that Wiley may have stopped his car on the bridge due to a flat tire or mechanical problem. Perhaps he had gotten out to assess the situation, and while walking on the narrow shoulder, either slipped or became disoriented and fell over the guardrail into the river below. The fall of approximately 70 feet into the cold water would have been fatal or incapacitating, leading to drowning. This scenario, while tragic, would make the death accidental rather than suspicious. However, numerous aspects of the case troubled Wiley's family colleagues and some investigators. The car had no mechanical problems, and the tires were fine. Why would Wiley have stopped on the bridge? Even if he needed to stop, the bridge shoulder was dangerous, and any reasonable driver would continue to the end of the bridge before pulling over. Wiley was described as intelligent and cautious, making the behavior attributed to him seem uncharacteristic. The timing of Wiley's death added to suspicions. November 2001 was less than 2 months after the September 11th terrorist attacks, and during the anthrax letters incidents, when letters containing deadly anthrax spores were mailed to media figures and politicians. The bioterrorism threat was at the forefront of national security concerns. Wiley's expertise in infectious diseases and his knowledge of how to weaponize pathogens made him a valuable asset for biodefense, but also potentially a target. Conspiracy theories emerged suggesting Wiley may have been killed by terrorists or foreign agents seeking to eliminate American biodefense experts. Alternatively, some speculated Wiley had learned classified information related to the anthrax attacks or other bioweapon programs and was silenced to prevent disclosure. The FBI's involvement in the investigation, though normal for high-profile cases, fueled speculation that Wiley's death had national security implications. Wiley's family struggled to accept the accidental death conclusion. They noted that Don was in good health, had been looking forward to upcoming holidays with family, and was enthusiastic about his research. He had no history of depression or suicidal thoughts. The idea that he would abandon his car on a bridge and somehow fall into the river seemed inconsistent with everything they knew about him. Some investigators have noted similarities between Wiley's case and deaths of other microbiologists and bioweapons researchers around the same time period. Between 2001 and 2005, an unusual number of scientists working in these fields died under suspicious or unusual circumstances. While each case has individual explanations, the clustering raised questions about whether a pattern existed. Wiley's death is often cited as the most prominent case in this alleged pattern. Skeptical analysis of the Wiley case points to the dangers of bridge shoulders and the possibility of genuine accident. The Mississippi River is a treacherous waterway, and falling into it, especially at night, from a significant height, would almost certainly be fatal. The decomposition of the body, after a month in the water, eliminated evidence that might have clarified cause of death. Without signs of foul play, the simplest explanation is tragic accident. The toxicology report showed Wiley had a blood alcohol level slightly above the legal limit for driving. He had consumed alcohol at the banquet dinner, which might have affected his judgment or balance. This finding supports the accident theory, suggesting impaired decision-making led to the fatal fall. However, the level was not extremely high, and Wiley's colleagues did not report him appearing intoxicated. More than 2 decades after Don Wiley's death, questions remain for those who knew him. The official accidental death ruling has never been changed, but the circumstances continue to seem strange to many observers. Wiley's expertise in deadly pathogens, his position at the forefront of biodefense research, and the timing during a period of bioterrorism concerns keep speculation alive about whether there was more to his death than accident. Don Wiley's scientific legacy continues through his research, which advanced understanding of viral infections and immune responses. Students he trained and research he published remain influential in immunology and virology. But the circumstances of his death ensure he is remembered not only for his scientific achievements, but as a brilliant researcher who died mysteriously, leaving behind unanswered questions about what happened on a bridge over the Mississippi River on a cold November night in 2001. Scientist number 9. James McDonald, atmospheric physicist, 1971. Dr. James McDonald was a senior physicist at the University of Arizona's Institute of Atmospheric Physics and one of the most credible scientific voices researching unidentified flying objects in the 1960s. McDonald used rigorous scientific methods to investigate UFO cases and publicly argued that extraterrestrial visitation deserved serious study. In June 1971, McDonald died from a gunshot wound to the head in an apparent suicide. The death came after a period where McDonald faced professional ridicule and personal difficulties related to his UFO research. Questions remain about whether the brilliant scientist was driven to suicide or whether his death was connected to his investigations into classified aerospace programs. James Edward McDonald was born in 1920 in Duluth, Minnesota. He earned his doctorate in physics from MIT in 1949 and became a leading expert in cloud physics and atmospheric science. McDonald joined the University of Arizona in 1954 and conducted respected research on meteorology, cloud formation, and atmospheric electricity. He was a senior physicist with an exemplary reputation in mainstream atmospheric science. In the mid-1960s, McDonald became interested in UFO reports after encountering cases that seemed to involve atmospheric phenomena he could not explain. Unlike many UFO researchers who lacked scientific credentials, McDonald brought rigorous methodology to investigating sightings. He interviewed witnesses, analyzed physical evidence, and applied physics to assess whether conventional explanations could account for observations. McDonald concluded that some UFO cases were genuinely unexplained and merited serious scientific study. McDonald became convinced that the scientific community was dismissing UFO phenomena without proper investigation. He believed the evidence suggested extraterrestrial visitation was the most plausible explanation for the most credible UFO cases. McDonald testified before Congress, appeared on television, and published papers arguing that UFOs deserved scientific attention. His credentials and careful approach made him one of the most prominent scientific advocates for taking UFO phenomena seriously. However, McDonald's UFO research damaged his professional standing. Many colleagues viewed his interest in UFOs as pseudoscience that compromised his credibility. McDonald faced ridicule and criticism from other scientists who felt he was wasting his abilities on fringe topics. The controversy affected his career, with some institutions distancing themselves from his work. McDonald persisted, believing the scientific importance of the question justified the professional costs. In March 1971, McDonald testified at a congressional hearing about environmental issues, specifically the effects of supersonic transport aircraft on the ozone layer. During this testimony, a congressman ridiculed McDonald bringing up his UFO research to discredit his environmental testimony. The congressman suggested someone who believed in flying saucers should not be taken seriously on scientific matters. The public humiliation deeply affected McDonald, who was trying to contribute legitimate science on an important environmental issue. Shortly after this incident, McDonald's personal life deteriorated. His marriage was failing, and he was experiencing health problems, including complications from diabetes. Colleagues noted McDonald seemed depressed and withdrawn. On June 13, 1971, McDonald was found in the Arizona desert with a gunshot wound to the head. He survived initially and was hospitalized, but died from his injuries on June 13, 1971. The death was ruled a suicide. The official conclusion was that McDonald's personal and professional difficulties had led him to take his own life. The combination of professional ridicule, marital problems, and health issues created overwhelming stress. McDonald's depression was documented, and suicide seemed consistent with his mental state. Family and close associates accepted this explanation, though they mourned the loss of a brilliant mind driven to despair. However, some researchers have questioned whether McDonald's death might have been connected to his investigations. In the years before his death, McDonald had sought access to classified government files on UFOs. He had contacts within military and intelligence communities and may have learned information about secret aerospace programs or actual UFO encounters that were highly classified. If McDonald discovered evidence of technologies being concealed or learned details that compromised national security, he could have become a target. Conspiracy theories suggest McDonald may have been murdered or driven to suicide through psychological operations designed to silence him. Intelligence agencies had capabilities to manipulate targets through various means. If McDonald was seen as a threat because of what he knew, or was about to reveal eliminating him, while making it appear as suicide would be an effective solution. The public humiliation by Congress could have been orchestrated to destabilize him psychologically, making suicide seem plausible. These theories remain speculative without supporting evidence. The circumstances of McDonald's death were investigated at the time and found consistent with suicide. There is no documented proof of foul play or intelligence agency involvement. The simplest explanation is that a brilliant scientist facing multiple personal and professional crises made the tragic decision to end his life. What is undeniable is that McDonald's UFO research made him controversial and affected his career. Whether this contributed directly to his death, or whether his death was coincidental to his UFO work, McDonald serves as an example of the professional risks faced by credentialed scientists who investigate phenomena outside mainstream acceptance. His willingness to apply scientific rigor to questions others dismissed as nonsense made him a pioneer, but also a target for ridicule. McDonald's scientific work on atmospheric physics continues to be cited and respected. His contributions to understanding cloud formation and atmospheric processes were significant, but he is equally remembered for his UFO research and the questions about his death. Some see him as a martyr who was destroyed for pursuing truth. Others view him as a talented scientist who unfortunately became obsessed with an unproductive area that damaged his life and career. The circumstances of James McDonald's death raise questions relevant to discussions of scientists who may have discovered too much. If McDonald learned classified information through his UFO investigations, did that knowledge contribute to his death? Was he murdered or driven to suicide because of what he knew? Or did his legitimate scientific curiosity about an unconventional topic simply lead to professional isolation and personal crisis that proved fatal? Without definitive evidence, these questions remain matters of speculation, but McDonald's death reminds us that scientists who venture into controversial areas may face consequences beyond professional disagreement. Scientist number 10. Microbiologists' Deaths Cluster, 2001 to 2005. Between 2001 and 2005, an unusual number of microbiologists and scientists working on infectious diseases and bioweapons research died under suspicious or unusual circumstances. More than a dozen researchers from different countries and institutions perished in accidents, murders, and apparent suicides during this period. The clustering of deaths among scientists with similar expertise raised questions about whether they were being targeted. While mainstream investigations found no connection between the deaths, conspiracy theories emerged suggesting the scientists were eliminated because of knowledge they possessed about bioweapons programs, engineered pandemics, or other classified research. The pattern of deaths first gained public attention through the work of independent researchers who noticed that multiple microbiologists had died within a short time frame. The victims worked in various countries, including the United States, United Kingdom, Russia, and Australia. Their fields of expertise overlapped in infectious diseases, genetic engineering, and biodefense research. The timing of many deaths shortly after the September 11th attacks and during the anthrax letters incidents made the pattern seem especially suspicious. One of the first cases involved Dr. Benito Key, a cellular biologist at the University of Miami, who collapsed near his laboratory in November 2001. Initial reports suggested Key had been attacked, but the official conclusion was death from natural causes, possibly a heart attack. The ambiguity of the circumstances and the fact that Quay worked on infectious disease research led to speculation about foul play. Dr. Don Wiley's death in November 2001, which we discussed earlier, was another case in this cluster. His disappearance from a bridge and drowning in the Mississippi River occurred during the peak period of the deaths. Wiley's prominence as an immunology researcher made his death particularly notable. In November 2001, Dr. Vladimir Pasechnik, a Russian microbiologist who had defected to Britain after working on Soviet bioweapons programs, died from a stroke. Pasechnik had provided intelligence about Soviet biological warfare research, and his death at age 64, though medically plausible, occurred during the suspicious clustering period. Some wondered whether Russian intelligence had finally caught up with the defector. Dr. Setvant Nguyen died in December 2001 in Australia, when the airlock to a laboratory storage room containing dangerous viruses sealed while he was inside. Van Nguyen suffocated before being discovered. The death was ruled accidental, but the fact that a microbiologist died in a locked biological storage facility raised questions about whether it might have been murder staged as accident. In February 2002, Dr. Ian Langford was found dead in his home in England. Langford worked on environmental risk assessment, including biological hazards. His death was ruled suicide, but family members disputed this conclusion, noting no suicide note was left, and Langford had no history of depression. The suspicious circumstances led to speculation about whether Langford's knowledge of biological threats made him a target. Dr. Tanya Holzmeier was shot and killed in February 2002 in California by a colleague who then killed himself. Holzmeier worked for a biotech company researching therapeutic applications of infectious disease research. While officially a murder-suicide related to workplace disputes, some wondered whether the incident might have been connected to their research rather than personal conflict. Dr. David Wynne Williams died in March 2002 in a traffic accident in England. Wynne Williams was an astrobiologist researching extremophile organisms and had expertise relevant to biological warfare agents. His death in a car crash was ruled accidental, but added to the growing list of deceased microbiologists. These represent just some of the cases cited in analyses of the microbiologist deaths cluster. Depending on how loosely one defines the criteria, different researchers count between 12 and over 40 deaths during the 2001 to 2005 period. The variation in numbers reflects debates about which deaths should be included and whether the scientists involved were truly similar enough in expertise to suggest a pattern. Mainstream investigations by law enforcement and intelligence agencies examined whether the deaths were connected. Official conclusions consistently found no evidence of conspiracy or coordinated targeting. Each death was explainable individually as accident, natural causes, suicide, or conventional murder. Authorities maintained the clustering was coincidental and that death rates among the small community of elite microbiologists were consistent with normal statistical expectations. However, critics of the official conclusions argued that the death rate among this specific group during this specific time period was statistically anomalous. Actuaries noted that the probability of so many researchers dying within a few years by accident or unusual circumstances seemed low. The fact that many victims worked on biodefense or had knowledge of bioweapons programs suggested they might have been targeted. Several theories emerged attempting to explain the pattern if it was not coincidental. One theory proposed that a foreign power, possibly a nation-state or terrorist organization, was eliminating Western biodefense experts to weaken defensive capabilities. By killing researchers who understood how to counter biological attacks, the perpetrators would leave nations more vulnerable to future bioweapon use. Another theory involved silencing scientists who had learned uncomfortable truths about bioweapons programs. Perhaps some of these researchers discovered evidence of illegal weapons development, unethical experiments, or planned false flag operations using biological agents. Eliminating them would prevent disclosure. The timing after September 11 and during the anthrax attacks period suggested possible connection to terrorism investigations or classified responses. A more speculative theory proposed the scientists were being eliminated because they had discovered evidence that AIDS, SARS, or other diseases were engineered bioweapons rather than natural phenomena. If researchers learned that pandemics were artificially created, they would become threats to whoever created the diseases. This theory is highly controversial and lacks supporting evidence, but circulates in conspiracy communities. Skeptics of the conspiracy theories note that microbiologists are not an exceptionally rare group. Thousands of researchers work in related fields. Over a 5-year period, some number of deaths from various causes would be expected in any professional community. The appearance of a pattern might reflect confirmation bias, where researchers noticed deaths in this community while ignoring similar death rates in other professions. Media attention created feedback loops, where each death was highlighted, reinforcing perception of a pattern. Statistical analysis of whether the death rate was truly anomalous produces ambiguous results depending on assumptions about population size and baseline death rates. Some analyses suggest the clustering exceeds normal expectations, while others find it within statistical possibility. Without definitive data proving an elevated death rate, the question remains open to interpretation. The individual circumstances of each death also matter. Some deaths like Wiley's have genuinely mysterious elements that raise legitimate questions. Others, like cases where murder-suicide was clearly established, or where natural causes were confirmed, seem less suspicious. Lumping all deaths together into a single conspiracy theory may obscure the fact that different cases have different explanations. Nevertheless, the cluster of microbiologist deaths remains one of the most discussed anomalies in modern science mortality patterns. Whether coordinated targeting, bizarre coincidence, or something in between, the deaths of multiple researchers with expertise in deadly pathogens during a period of heightened bioterrorism concerns created legitimate grounds for questions. The unwillingness of authorities to consider connections and the rapid closure of investigations frustrated those who believed something sinister was occurring. The phenomenon also highlights broader concerns about bioweapons research and the scientists who conduct it. These researchers, by necessity, have knowledge of how to create and disseminate deadly diseases. They understand vulnerabilities in public health systems and how pathogens could be weaponized. Such knowledge makes them valuable for defensive research, but also potentially dangerous if their loyalties shift or if they decide to reveal classified programs. The cluster of deaths between 2001 and 2005 serves as a modern example of the vulnerability of scientists working in sensitive fields. Whether they were targeted or simply unlucky, their deaths removed expertise that took decades to develop. Each death represented not just personal tragedy, but loss of knowledge, crucial for defending against biological threats. The mystery of whether the pattern was natural or engineered remains unresolved, ensuring that discussions of scientists who discovered too much will always include reference to the microbiologists who died during those few suspicious years at the beginning of the 21st century.